for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome back to the HR Uprising podcast. It's 2023, would you believe it? So I hope you had a lovely, restful Christmas and New Year, lots of quality time with family and friends. And this year we have got loads of great stuff in store for you. However, I really want to make it as relevant and as interesting as possible for you. So please do get in touch, whether it's directly with me through the LinkedIn group, and suggest great people that you'd like to hear on here. Suggest yourself if you've got something fresh to tell us about. It's only as good as our guests and the content that we share. So we may have done 180 odd episodes, but I still think we've got a few more in us. So please do feel free to connect, join in and tell me what you want to hear about on the HR Uprising podcast in 2023. On to this week, we're all about high performance habits with Dr. Jon Finn. I felt that was a really appropriate way to start the year. So I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week we're going to talk about the power of habits. Now, I'm delighted that I've got Dr. Jon Finn here with me, who has founded the award-winning Tougher Minds consultancy. He's got no less than 3 psychology-related degrees, including a PhD. Now, he's worked in performance psychology. We're going to have a chat offline about sports psychology. There's lots of stuff there. And I know there's lots of information out on habits. His book that he's recently, his best-selling book that is in front of me right now, is called The Habit Mechanic. And I read through it with interest. It's taken him 20 years in the making. It's got loads of really valuable information that we can all take as individuals out of it. And I have to say that I actually think I've been a better person this week in terms of some positive habits than I was prior to reading this. How long I can keep them going, that will be interesting. But what we're going to focus in on, I'm going to get Dr. Jon to actually introduce himself in a moment, but we're going to focus in on how we can apply these to business. So I guess I would absolutely recommend you listen to his podcast and have a read of his book for your own personal benefit. And Jon will give us some context, but we want to focus in on how we as people professionals can support others in our business to get the benefit out of great habits. So Dr. Jon, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, well, thank you for having me, Lucinda. We've worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of businesses, from some of the biggest businesses on the planet through to startups. I think it's important to understand that. I actually was doing a talk to senior leaders yesterday about improving employee performance in the hybrid workplace, which we know is challenging. And the first thing that I introduced to the leaders was a concept called first principle thinking. And Elon Musk is a big advocate of this. So he talks about how he uses first principle thinking, boiling things down to the most basic principles that he can. So if you want to build a cheaper battery, you've got to look at all the principles, etc. But you can take that to different professions. If you want to make Formula One cars go faster, you've got to look at the physics of the aerodynamics. If you want to get spaceships into the air, you've got to use physics. If you look at professional football, for example, because they've adopted sports science in over the last 20 years, even in the last 10 years, they've made professional footballers between 15 to 20% physically fitter. Now, here's the big problem we've had in the helping other people professions like HR. It's been very, very difficult to use first principle thinking. Roger Bannister, that I talk about in the book, who was the first person to run the mile in sub 4 minutes, he was able to use first principle thinking about his physiology in the 1950s when he was studying at Oxford University, because he was able to measure the gas exchange in his body and understand the importance of oxygen. When it comes to psychology, when it comes to helping other people to do better, we've been relying on what we call black box theories, theories that have developed where we haven't actually understood what goes on inside people's brains. Now, this is a huge problem because your business runs on brains, or brains run your business. And we haven't really understood how they work before. And those insights that we've started to gather from technologies like functional MRI scanners, although we've got tidbits of information, they haven't really made it into the mainstream to help us to use those insights to help us to develop better performance management systems so we can achieve our strategic objectives. That's why I wrote The Habit Mechanic, because I want to empower everyone to use those insights to help themselves and everybody else to do better. And of course, the first thing that we find when we start to look at brains is brains run on habits. And again, we've had this outdated black box thinking. Habits are about 50% of what we do, or habits are just the physical things that we do. It's a nonsense. Habits range from 100% of what you think and do. Think about your instinctive reactions that are not conscious at all, down to about 98% of what you think and do. So most of what we're doing most of the time is mindless automatic behavior.
So
we
only
are not
2% is conscious, basically, is what you're saying.
As a maximal, we have 2% as conscious, and the top scientists in this area think that's probably an overestimation. So we are running on autopilot most of the time. And we can think of our brain, it's like a trillion tiny mechanical cogs that are whirling round mindlessly, that drive our belief systems, our biases, everything that we think and we do, essentially. And we have a tiny bit of consciousness. So we are like super computers. We can't get a computer to replicate what the human brain does yet. So your organization is packed full of super computers, but no one's shown us the operating manual yet. And that's why I heard a statistic, and I suppose we could couple that first insight, your business or brains run your business, with it's harder than ever for people to get their brains working well because of the world that we live in, the VUCA world, the cost of living crisis, everything that's going on, the pandemic. And I heard some data I was doing a podcast called the HR Power Podcast, and I was listening to a few previous episodes. This was a recent podcast. This data was cited by a guy called, I think it's called Kevin Campbell, and he's a human experience scientist. And he said some recent data came out from, I think, the HR Institute that says only 9% of businesses think that their performance management systems actually deliver for the business, actually help the business achieve its strategic objectives. And for me, that's a mirror to the challenging world that we live in, where it's harder than ever for people to get their brains working properly, but also because those systems are not built on with brain function in mind. They're not built on first principle thinking, because we haven't really been able to use those insights before to build our performance management systems. Now we can use those insights, and we can build strategies and performance management systems that are based on how people's brains actually work, so that we can make it super easy for people to build the kind of habits that make their personal lives easier, that make teams work better, that make it easy for the businesses to achieve its strategic outcomes. So that's a summary overview of the things I'm interested in business.
Okay, so that's, I mean, great. All of that's performance management systems. In a particular, I'd love to hear the insight into how do you make it work? Because it's almost like these computers. So we're saying almost we're running the wrong program for the systems that we have. And we may have always been doing that, but now I'm imagining in hybrid working, everyone's remote, and maybe the visibility of the programs that we're working to isn't necessarily there, and maybe the habits that we've got may not be as effective, because so we're all working to habits, whether we're in the office or if we're working remotely. The question is whether those habits are productive habits from the point of view of us as individuals, but also from the point of view of the business outcomes. And of course, what I really would want to know is, as both a business leader and also as someone who's a people professional, how can we make sure that we are operating where we are conscious? How well can we make sure that we are as effective as possible? And I might need you to actually explain a bit more about maybe first principle thinking for me and black box theories, because just to unpick all of this.
Yeah, so just to go back to the 9% idea, what does that mean? It means that businesses don't think that what they want their people to do, what they know they'd like their people to do, they don't think their people are actually doing that. Yeah. That's what the performance management systems are supposed to do. They're supposed to move people from knowing what they should do to doing it. And that's when we understand how brains work, that's not surprising. More people than ever before know and actually agree it's a great idea to eat about 5 portions of fruit and veg a day and to walk 10,000 steps. Yet in the UK, the NHS is still spending, I think latest figures are, over half of its budget. And we know the NHS is the biggest company in Europe, over half of its budget on diseases that emerge because people don't do those things. And that's not just a UK specific problem. We don't do what we know we should do. We do what we're in the habit of doing. Because again, if we go back to first principle thinking, the number one operating rule of the brain is it does what's easiest to do, because our brain wants to conserve energy at all costs. It doesn't like changing. Whatever is easiest for us is what we've practiced the most, what we are in the habit of doing. So if you think of the default tool we use to try to change people and try to change ourselves is what scientists would call verbal persuasion. So we persuade ourselves it'd be a good idea to get to bed a bit earlier tonight. It would be a good idea to get out for a walk at lunchtime. It would be a good idea not to have a dessert tonight because I'm watching my work. So we persuade ourselves what we do. And of course, we don't end up doing most of those things. It's the same with the NHS example, with the government persuading us that it's a good idea to do this and it's a good idea to do that. But because brains don't run on what we know we should do, they run on what we're in the habit of doing, then knowing is futile almost. We've got to help people to build better habits. So instead of having knowledge-based strategies, and this is what I spend a lot of my time helping HR teams, helping senior leaders to move away from knowledge-based strategies. This is what we know we'd like our people to do. And here's how it connects to our big goals. We've got to move to habit-based strategies. What are the habits that are going to help our people to be at their best in their general life and also when they're working for us? And that means we've got to work out what are the destructive habits that are stopping them being at their best and what are the super habits we can use. So that's step one. Step number two is we've got to use insights from behavioral science to unblock the factors that are stopping our people developing those habits. So we've created and it's in the book, our proprietary 9 action factor model, which takes all the different expertise of behavioral science, because behavioral science is a scattered, complex discipline. And I'm not compelled that any one theory explains everything about why we do what we do, which is why we've created our 9 action factor model. There are these 9 factors that are driving everything that's good and bad in your business. And they're broadly invisible to us. So we think about, we've got to inspire and we've got to motivate people. That's one factor. We've got to model the right behaviors. That's another factor. We've got to incentivize people. That's another factor. We've got to keep reminding people and triggering them up to. That's another factor. That's just 4 of the 9. And we've got to work out where are the blockages and what's stopping our people actually developing the habits, the automated thinking and behavioral patterns that are going to help them to be at their best, help the business be at its best. Work out what those are. So we've got to start to work out what's blocking the system. And step 3 is we create a plan, a strategic plan to help to activate the factors and get them working for our people instead of against our people. So
Yeah.
they're the three simple steps that we use to help senior leaders to do that.
I was just trying to remind myself of the 9 5. So yeah, so I see some parallels in some of the points that you make between things. You said earlier, listen to a change management podcast that I do, but things in change management, for example, so role modeling.
HR Power podcast, sorry.
Right. Yeah. So you have to role model things. So there are lots of things that appreciate this is your proprietary model, but that things that would be familiar to us in HR anyway. But what you're saying is that there's sort of science behind why those things are really important. And we're saying that we need to help people become aware of the habits that they have in the first place, sort of consciously aware, and then help them decide to change them.
If we want to learn a new behavior, we have to go from knowledge to skill to habit. That's the key thread. So if I want to build a better stress management habit, I'm going to need some new knowledge and skills about how to manage my stress, for example. If I want to build a better productivity habit, I probably need to get some more knowledge and skills about how to do that. Same for better sleep, same to become a better leader. And then what I need to use is the behavioral science to make it as easy as possible to keep practicing the new habits, essentially, the new micro behaviors that lead to the habits. That's the key thing. And I think that being aware of ideas is one thing. Using them in a strategic way to help us to make sustainable change is a very different thing. So if we go back to that Roger Bannister example, just to demystify what the black box piece means. So when Bannister was training to break that record, because that was his aim, people have been trying to break that record since 20, 30 years before then. And at the time, it was interesting. There were two other athletes. It was an Australian and an American, John Landy and Wes Santee. They were doing the same. What Bannister was able to do, he was studying medicine at Oxford University, and he was also a research scholar. And his research was all about the human respiratory system. And he was doing research on treadmills, looking at gas exchange. And through the research, he was able to work out the essential role of oxygen in the type of running that he was doing. That wasn't understood before. So instead of just thinking of his body as a black box, he was starting to understand some of the core processes that were going to help his body to make the adaptations that he needed to make so he could actually run faster. Whereas his competitors were just simply looking at the training they were doing versus the output they were getting. They weren't actually aware of what impact did this training have on my body at a microphysiological level. So Bannister adapted his training routines and his training habits and his running habits, even his running style, to help him to conserve oxygen. So we haven't been able to think about the brain like that before because we've only been able to look inside it quite recently. So ultimately, brains are running what we do. Habits run brains. That's well understood. And I think we think of humans as logical and conscious. And if they know what to do because they're well-intended, they'll do it. But that isn't how we operate. We run on habits. And I've just had a Forbes article accepted. Essentially, the central pillar is we need to move away. We need to think less about human capital and more about habit capital, because habits are driving the business and they are our most precious resource from a personal health, happiness, performance aspect, but also from doing our jobs really well so the business can achieve its goals.
So the question is, though, how do we create habits, or how do we help other people to create the habits that we want to serve the business, which may involve unpicking other ones? And I get the sort of the verbal persuasion and insights, but there's going to be something about motivation or changing old behaviors, because the path of least resistance is where we will have gone for an awful lot of these habits. So how could
how
could I do that?
Motivation is one of the nine action factors. So it explains about 11% of why we do what we do. Sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. So we tougher minds, that's what we've crafted our expertise in, helping businesses to start analysing their people's habits. And when you get down to it, there are some fundamental things that if you can help people to build better habits in these areas, life gets a lot easier. starting with the basics of better sleep, better diet, better exercise, better stress management, helping people to build better confidence habits, better productivity habits, better performing under pressure habits, better leadership habits. They're the kind of the core factors that we see. And when you help people to build these better behaviors, we typically see that you can save people about 5 hours a week. 5 hours a week where they're not beating themselves up, they're not procrastinating on important work, they're not multitasking and therefore making mistakes. They'll have to repeat the work again, or someone else has to repeat it. So when you start to help people to understand how their brain works and how to make these tiny adjustments using science essentially to do that, then their life gets a lot easier.
So if I was a line manager and I'm working with someone who's worked remotely since they're relatively young in a sort of administrative role, so I don't even know what their habits are because they bring certain things. It's not that visible to me. I've only worked remotely with them. How could I? Because I can see how this makes sense in terms of people's well-being and sleep. But there's one of those things also. There's a sense that are you encroaching? There's almost this grey area now that since people are working remotely, is that encroaching on people, telling them, making sure that they are sleeping and eating? You can kind of encourage it. How can we educate or encourage people to take on positive habits as an employer when they might feel like it's kind of crossing a line?
Yeah, and I think the word habit is a barrier here, maybe, because we think of habits as something else, it's over there. It's not. It's driving everything that we think and do. So how can we encourage people to think and do things that are more helpful for them to do their job well would be a better way of thinking about it. Okay. And automate those thinking things. And as soon as the onboarding process when you come into a business, as I know is part of your system, is designed to say, here's how we do it here. It's so this is foundational for everything else that we do. If the automatic way we're thinking isn't helpful for our health and our happiness, nothing good is going to be built on top of that. So this has to be a fundamental part of how we help our people to be their best. Some of the super habits that we know are essential for starting and sustaining positive change are what we call intelligent self-watching. So helping people to be checking in with themselves more often. So we have an app called the Habit Mechanic University app, which we just launched, which is, the book's only a few months old, or it's maybe six months old now. So the Habit Mechanic University app is just a place that it's free, anyone can join. And we go in there every day and we do our self-watching. We do our T plan, for example, our tiny empowering action plan, which takes 2 minutes a day. And I know it saves me more than an hour every day just by doing that. Now I'm creating my T plan with quite a high level of what I call habit mechanic intelligence. But even if you don't have such a high level of habit mechanic intelligence, you still do a little bit better. And I think that's what you were referring to before, Lucinda, where you said, just thinking about these ideas in the book, I feel I'm doing better because it's making us do some intelligent self-watching. Because most of what we're doing is on autopilot, we're not really, our brain isn't wired to make us think about ourselves. We're thinking about the outside world because we have this tiny bit of consciousness. And that tiny bit of consciousness that we've got is being increasingly depleted by the VUCA world, by the pandemic, by the distractions of and real issues, cost of living, adapting to new technologies so we can communicate, worrying about, did I get my message across on the video call because it's a bit harder when I'm not in person with people. So this tiny bit of consciousness that we've got is getting hugely depleted by the challenges of the modern world. So habits run our business, whether we like it or not. It's not a side issue. It's the fundamental thing that drives the business. And we haven't really understood them before. We can understand them now, and we can make it easier for people to understand their own habits and start building new ones. So what we see is when you start to help people understand their habits in your business, it has three broad positive impacts. One, it helps them with their life. It helps them in everything they're trying to do in their life. And they're really appreciative that the business is helping them to do this. They're giving them such meaningful support. It helps the team to build trust and psychological safety, because all of a sudden you've got people talking about they're working on themselves and they're learning about themselves and they're not perfect. And it's okay to talk about this in this team. And you start to get these much deeper, meaningful relationships. even though people are working remotely most of the time now. And thirdly, people report that they do more focused, clever work every day. They use what we call their high charge brain states. So the biggest challenge that we see is that people are doing more and more busy work, which speaks to the fact that we're running on habits. So becoming a habit mechanic allows people to do more focused, clever, productive work, which not only delivers for the business, but it makes them feel better about themselves, because making personal progress is key for happiness, and it's harder than ever to do. And that's all by helping people to become habit mechanics and helping leaders to become chief habit mechanics.
So I'm trying to think, so productivity being a key one, which actually some areas where leaders maybe are wanting people to go back into the workplace, they're thinking that they'll be more productive. And productivity is probably the thing, isn't it, in terms of habits? I mean, so if I was thinking of a productivity habit, you're talking about times a day, don't you, or times when you've got certain capacity for each type of work. So would an example of being aware is being aware of what my habits are in relation to what I do first thing in the morning. So if, for example, I choose to plan my day the day before and work on the really hard bit of work first thing in the morning without opening my emails, if that's my habit of doing that, then that's a productive habit, let's say, because that's my best time of day. Or if I've got into the habit of sitting down and sitting in my emails, for an hour, and then I've lost the best bit of the day, that would be a less positive habit. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about with productivity, or is there more to it in terms of how you schedule your time and how you use your time?
Yeah, and I think these are real micro behaviors. We want to focus on the super habits.
Right.
What's going to help me to activate up to have a really good day? And tools like the T plan, for example, creating a willpower story, for example, they're the habits we want to activate with people. So if we think of productivity, for me, that's an outcome. So it's an outcome of my brain working well, which means good sleep, good diet, good exercise, good stress management, confidence in what I'm doing, and me understanding how to manage my brain states throughout the course of the day. And what helps different people to be productive looks a little bit different. So we don't have a prescriptive program where you say you must do X, Y, and Z. That becoming a habit mechanic is all about being empowered to go on a personal journey where you learn more about yourself. You learn more about, well, what are your super habits and what are your destructive habits? And you go on this journey of building more super habits and getting rid of more destructive habits. For me, every day is a bit like a barcode. So there's only 24 hours in a day. That's all we've got. Think of, instead of a black and white barcode, think of a blue and red barcode. The blue times are when we're doing and thinking things that are helping us to be healthy, happy, and at our best. The red lines, which people are increasing, there are more and more of, or reporting there are more and more of, are times when we're thinking and doing things that are getting in the way of us being at our best. Those blue lines and those red lines are both habits. They're both driven by automated behaviors. So what we do as habit mechanics is we become aware of those lines and we deliberately work on getting rid of the red lines, one tiny red line at a time. And as chief habit mechanics, as senior leaders, we use the science to help us to build cultures and performance management systems that make it really easy for people to build and sustain new helpful habits.
And actually, you talk about this, how to build a high performance culture, don't you, in the book? Could you explain that a bit? Because that's quite a useful thing for people to be able to see if you move away from the individual.
Yeah, so I think it's helpful to start with, what does culture mean? Well, the origin of culture, if people don't know, it's a Latin word which refers to agriculture. So think of a farmer trying to cultivate their crops. That's what they're trying to do. And that word culture's come into sort of the human performance space. So if we're trying to create a great culture, we're trying to create, like, think of you've got a farm and you're trying to create the right conditions to get the right soil. Now, an extended problem with the hybrid workplace is your people are not coming to the farm every day anymore. They've got their own farm essentially that they're working on, where the cultural conditions are less out of your control. And I think that we may, if we think about human capital or people being our most important resource, we probably think about we're trying to grow and nurture the people in the soil. And people we think of as they're conscious and they're logical and they're really well intended, which they are. But actually, humans are run by their brains, and brains are not all that conscious and logical. If we look at people like Daniel Kahneman's research, Thinking Fast and Slow, won a Nobel Prize for that work. We have biases and we have automated belief systems. So actually, it's much better to think about you're trying to nurture people's brains in these conditions. And that's why we hear things like psychological safety is so important for a good culture, because without psychological safety, brains don't work well. They are magnetized towards threats and problems and worry. And that tiny bit of consciousness that we have in our brain gets wiped out. So we've got to work out what conditions do we need to create to help people's brains work really well. And then if people's brains are working really well and we trust each other, that's going to drive good communication, good collaboration, and that's going to allow us to be excellent at solving problems for our business and for our clients so we can delight our clients. So they're the fundamental ideas, but great cultures are only going to happen if you've got great habits, ultimately, which until very recently has been invisible to us. And that's why it's been really hard to get this right.
So what would be the great habits that leaders would be demonstrating that would be sowing the right, creating the right, fertilizing the right soil or whatever it is, as your analogy goes, in terms of creating that great culture?
Yeah, so our chief or our team power leadership model, and I would say everyone has a leadership responsibility because everyone has influence. So leadership's just about influencing other people's behavior. Fundamentally, that's what it means. You can influence people in a positive way, think Nelson Mandela, or you can influence people in a negative way, think Darth Vader. And that can be a tiny, tiny negative, like rolling your eyes in a meeting, just body language, or it can be a huge negative impact, or it can be a tiny positive or tiny or a huge positive. So our team power leadership model has 4 components. One is the role model, what other people see you doing. And everyone should be working on making themselves a better role model. And that's a big part of becoming a habit mechanic. The second part is what we call action communicator. Communicating in a way that makes it really easy for people's brains to work well. And everybody from your graduates upwards should be working on becoming better action communicators. And in the habit mechanic book, we break all this down into tiny little habits. The third element we call a cultural architect. Now, we don't need everyone to be better cultural architects right now. This is going to be the senior leaders in the business. We need them to understand how to create cultures that make it really easy for people's brains to work well and make it easy for people to work together towards shared goals and objectives. And the fourth element is what we call a SWOT coach. SWOT is our most basic change model: self-watch, make a name, make a behavioral science-backed plan. So SWOT coaching is about actually helping people to build new habits, not just helping people to know what would be a good idea for them to do. And that's why I found in my early education, these 3 degrees I've got were all about, if you could help people to do this, that would be great. But the science of how do you help people to do that was pretty much non-existent in a sustainable way. How do you actually help people to make positive change? So when you've learned how to do that yourself as a habit mechanic, you can help others to do it. And there's certain people in your business that you're going to want to be becoming better SWOT coaches. So that's a framework. We have another framework as well called the team power model, and you plug those 2 things together.
And that pulls it together. Just so your SWOT coach, I mean, the thing is, and I'm guilty, I used it in a podcast that I recorded recently. It hasn't gone out yet, but behavioral science, it's all very well saying to a leader do something backed by behavioral science, but they may not know what that is. Have you got any tips on how they can do that without, it's not like they have to go and get a psychology degree to do it?
Just read the final section in the habit mechanic book, because that's everything we teach people. And as you can see, Lucinda, that book is not a normal book. It's a manual for life. If you want to start becoming a better leader, read the final section in the book. And it breaks down all those 4 areas into probably about 150 different tactics that you can use. Just pick one tactic to start with. Start working on yourself.
And that you're confident that that's behaviorally science backed.
Yes. And the application of using the tactic, if you like, is one thing, but you've got to build that into a habit. So it'd be a great idea, actually, if I was a bit more positive with my direct reports. That's knowing it. That's just knowing. You use the habit building plans in the book, for example, to help you to build that habit. So we don't just give people more knowledge about what to do. That's what the book is probably all the core knowledge that we've got about this. We help people to turn it into habits. So we're not just saying to leaders, try this out because it's behaviorally science backed. We show you actually how to embed this into your life and into your business and how to make it work for you.
And I guess you can watch yourself, but you can also use tools like feedback that you've had from other people as to things that you may do or not do, which may be helpful or unhelpful habits to carry on doing or do less of. That would be a way in which you'd say those things.
Yeah, so for me, that's an extension of intelligent self-watching.
Yeah.
So yeah. I think this about myself, but what do you guys think?
Yeah.
But that allows us to know more.
Yes,
so
exactly. And it's
20
also
years
validating, isn't it? Because you're taking other people's views as well as to it.
For a long time, well, since its existence, which is I think just over 100 years, professional football teams have known they wanted their players to be fitter. Until they could access sports science, the first principle thinking insights about what actually makes people fitter.
Right.
They weren't that good at making people fitter. And that's why we've seen these seismic shifts in player fitness in the last 20 years or so. We can use this same science now that's only just becoming available to help our people to be healthier, to be happier, to be at their best more often. Not just knowing what's a good idea to do to help them to do that, but actually to automate that.
And then if we go back to the business, and let's circle back to one of the things you said right at the start, that 90% of businesses also don't feel that they achieve the aims that they're trying to achieve out of their performance management processes, whatever those may be. I mean, ultimately, processes are used by people. So I'm assuming that it's the habits that people have in using them, whether it's the managers or the individuals, that plays a part in the output. Is that the case? Or what would you say if people want to get more out of those processes using habits? What would you recommend?
Well, yeah, I mean, that data is from lots of businesses. So I would take what they mean by that is we know what we want our people to. And this is the biggest challenge I see here from senior leaders that we work with. I know what I want my people to do. I can't get them to do it. What's the biggest barrier to them doing it? They're too busy. They feel they're busier than ever. They feel they're so busy that they can't do anything but their day-to-day. They don't have any room to think strategically, for example. So I think the problem is that, and it's not anyone's fault, it's that the way we've created performance management systems isn't based on how brains actually work. In the way that 30 years ago, the way we were creating physical fitness systems for professional footballers wasn't based very accurately on what made you physically fitter to play a 90-minute game of professional football. So we're relying on these outdated black box models, things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs doesn't actually explain that it doesn't work. It's fundamentally flawed.
But what would work though? What does work in then? So if you're going to reinvent performance management systems to work in the way that habits do, so they would be supporting it, what would they look like? So
I'd use the 3-step process. What are the habits that we need to help our strategy work? So we know what we need to do to win. We know who our target customers are. We know what winning looks like for the business. We know what the mission is, the objective.
So you still need to agree and set goals with people. They need to know what to achieve, but it's then having the habits to achieve them.
Yeah, so I'm just going from the top of a sort of a strategic model. So we know what the mission is. We know who the customers are we're trying to serve. We know the basics of our success, from a product development, product delivery, from a sales marketing, all those things. We know the assets we're going to need to deliver those outcomes. And then the performance management system kind of sits under that. How do we get our people to do the things that we want them to do? What explains most of our people's behavior is the habitual things that they do, what they are in the habit of thinking and doing. So we need to work out what are the habits that are going to allow them to deliver these outcomes for the business. And those habits are going to come back to all the fundamental things that we think about. We need people to have good habits around that allow them to have good brain function, good sleep, good diet, good exercise. We need them to have good habits around managing stress, around managing their confidence, around being good leaders, around being efficient and effective with their time. So they're the fundamental things. And then we can help them.
I think I get all that, but I think that just brings a good person to work who's in a position to be able to work. That doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to put in discretionary effort in the direction of the business goals. So I think, and I don't know if we're talking at same person on across purposes on the performance management systems, but I mean, but behavioural science is very clear that people need goals, or they need to have goals that are linked to strategic outcomes. So, and there's a lot of messaging out there in terms of management practice that people need regular feedback, which would be maybe habits that managers should have to help people. So I'm just trying to fill the gap between the sort of well-being stuff and the people management stuff and see whether it fits with the habits. So would it be the case that then having clear goals that link to the strategy that maybe are broken down into smaller chunks so they become more habitual, that people apply themselves to or prioritize? Is that an example of it? Is it an example of then the leaders spending time on a regular basis talking to people about how they're doing against them? Are they the sort of practical habits we're talking about? Because when we're saying, because that's what I feel that performance management is about, but I don't know whether we agree there or not.
Is performance, what is the fundamental thing performance management is trying to do?
I think it's about aligning people's results in line with business results. So it's helping people be productive in line with business.
So if we dig deeper, what do we need people to do in order to help them to do that?
We want them to have clarity about what's expected and be motivated to do the best against those goals, basically be motivated to put in discretionary effort or be motivated to prioritize their time against the important stuff. I think it goes back to people understanding what's important. And you talked earlier about busy work as opposed to some of the unconscious stuff. So maybe we're talking about being as conscious about the important things which align with business goals, as opposed to being too busy as in what people are doing. So, it's that kind of...
If I know what to do, so I know that the business wants me to do this, does that guarantee that I will do it?
No, and that's my point, actually. How do we as HR or leaders get people to spend, because it's all very well having had a good night's sleep, but how do we make sure that they're actually going to choose those lovely fresh minds to spend it in the direction that the business wants them to? Because
the habits that we want to build are aligned with our strategic goals. So the way that the strategy model that we use, which is borrowed from Procter & Gamble, is the 5 questions that I went through before. What does winning look like for the business? So what are the objectives of the business? What's the mission? Number 2 is, where are we going to play? Who are the customers that we want to delight, in other words? Number 3 is, how are we going to win? So what are the basics of our success? Number 4 is, what assets do we need to deliver those basics of success? Part of that is going to be having people doing their jobs really well. And at the bottom of that model is, what performance management systems do we need to deliver all those outcomes? So that is absolutely connected with the business goals and the strategic way of thinking, which I know you talk about in your 5 superpower. We have to be more strategic with how we think. So we've got to plug in the performance management system to the strategy model. That's what we do, because people's habits, if people have the right habits, you're going to deliver the strategic goals. If they don't have the right habits, you won't deliver the strategic goals. And because everything that happens in the business is driven by this automatic behavior. It's
this whole kind of key, getting people to care, isn't it? And I saw you also talked about emotion, people actually engaging with it all as well. And there's actually so much we can go into here that I think we probably have to just whet people's appetites and direct them to various places, including your book. And the book's great in the fact that you can just pick it, you can dip in and out. You could refer to it as a manual. So the book is called The Habit Mechanic. Jon, do you want to tell people where else? Because you've got so many things. I know you mentioned you've got the new app, which I haven't downloaded yet. I will go and take a look at. How can they get in touch with you if they want to know more? Because I know you do training, etc. What's the best way for people to contact you?
Yes, you can check out our website, which is tougherminds.co.uk, tougherminds.co.uk, which I'm sure will be linked somewhere around the podcast.
Yeah, we'll put it on the show notes.
You can check out the book. That's an Audible and and physical, etc., which is on Amazon and all the other big online bookstores. I'm very active on LinkedIn. We have our app on both, which is called Habit Mechanic University, absolutely free, which is about triggering a really helpful super habit we've created called the Daily Tea Plan. That's on the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store. And yeah, you're welcome to download that and just start getting involved, really.
And you've got a podcast as well. So there's lots of places out there, I think, that people can find.
Yes, we have the Habit Mechanic podcast. Yeah, we do. We can check that out as well.
Yeah, so it's a tome, the book, but it's actually really digestible. So I do recommend people go and take a look and obviously get in touch with you, Jon, if they'd like to know more. So thanks so much for joining us on the HR Uprising podcast. Well,
thank you for having me, Lucinda. It's been a pleasure.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now, you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.